Welcome to where time falls quiet.
The Sumerian King List's most terrifying line. Take a moment to subscribe, so this place of calm is always here for you. Imagine holding in your hands a prism of clay, no larger than a wine bottle, covered on all its sides with wedge-shaped marks carved by a trembling reed, nearly 6,000 years ago. The surface is smooth in some places, rough in others, as if time itself had breathed unevenly over it. You can still see, under certain light, the faint ridges where the scribe's thumb pressed down to steady his gesture. And yet, this tablet, this bureaucratic document written in the cuneiform script of ancient Sumer, does not record the trade of barley or the count of slaves. It records the reigns of kings who ruled before history began. The first lines are deceptively simple, lists of names terse and unpoetic. They resemble an inventory more than a legend, Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana. Each followed by impossibly large numbers, tens of thousands of years per reign, stretching far beyond the span of any human lifetime. The list declares that kingship was lowered from heaven, as if authority itself was a physical structure descending out of the sky. Those words are not metaphorical in tone, they are procedural, as if describing the installation of a device. And when you read them aloud, slowly, they echo with something both administrative and divine. The voice that wrote them lived in a time when writing was still an experiment. Imagine being that scribe, seated in the temple schools of Eridu, the smell of burnt reeds and wet clay in the air. You were copying an older fragment, already half erased, its markings so faint that you had to guess at certain signs. You were not composing a story, you were preserving a record. Yet even as you copied, you must have felt the strangeness, numbers so vast that they mocked arithmetic, kings who ruled when even the rivers had different courses, and a flood that cleanly severed time into before and after. What makes the Sumerian King List unique is its tone of accounting. There is no mythic embellishment, no divine speeches or wars among gods. It reads as a ledger, clinical and precise. And yet, within that uniform dryness hides something more dangerous than any myth, the suggestion that civilization has memories longer than its own existence. The clay does not exaggerate, it remembers. It has kept an administrative whisper from a world that believed order did not begin with man. Consider the implications of a list that begins with kings who are not strictly human. What kind of civilization defines itself by rulers whose rule exceeds the lifespan of species? The Sumerians did not call their first kings founders. They called them restorers of a throne descended from heaven. This single phrase fractures the modern assumption that civilization arose slowly from primitive beginnings. Instead, it imagines authority as something reactivated after interruption, the aftermath of some older system, half remembered in ritual and number. When archaeologists first unearthed these tablets, they expected mythology and found instead mathematics. The durations, 43,200 years, 28,800, are not poetic flourishes, but multiples of 60, the base of the Sumerian sexagesimal system. That precision unnerved them. It was as if the text was not trying to impress, but to encode. Could it be that these vast spans of time were not literal, but cosmological? Records of celestial cycles mistaken for dynasties? Or worse, were they literal within another framework, one in which the human measure of years no longer applied? Pause on that thought. If kingship truly descended from heaven, as the text claims, then the act of rule was not originally terrestrial. It was a restoration of cosmic balance, perhaps mathematical in essence. Each ruler's enormous reign might represent not lifespan, but the precession of equinoxes, the turning of an astronomical gear that the ancients sought to record in a language of names. What appears as myth may, in fact, be the misremembered shorthand of a civilization translating star movements into dynastic reigns. But here is where the silence hums. For after 8 kings and thousands upon thousands of recorded years, the text stops abruptly. Then the flood swept over. Simple, absolute. It does not explain or dramatize. It merely closes the administrative column with a termination mark. This delineation between before and after, the antediluvian and post-diluvian, becomes the world's first chronological divide. Civilization itself is an aftershock of that silence. In those blank lines where writing ceases, an entire world drowns. Imagine standing at the edge of the excavated ruins of Ur, as Leonard Woolley once did, looking at sediment layers that alternate between silt and habitation debris. At a depth of 11 feet, a thick stratum of clean river clay, almost 4 feet deep, cuts across the levels of human occupation. It is an interruption, a geological pause. Above it, humanity resumes. Below it, traces of a people who built before the flood. The King List's "then the flood swept over" corresponds perfectly to this stratigraphic event. The myth was sediment deep. The silence was physical. That correspondence between text and earth troubled even the cautious scholars. If the flood line was real, what of the impossible kings who ruled before it? Traditional chronology could not absorb them, so academia divided the list into mythic preface and historical body. But that division seems itself artificial, a modern attempt to confine the depth of memory into the comfort of recordable centuries. The Sumerians did not draw that boundary, they inherited it. Their role was that of archivists collecting echoes. The very form of the King List reinforces this. Instead of stories, we have succession. Instead of theology, we have data. It resembles the structure of later royal annals, yet far older and colder in tone. Authority here is not a human invention, it is a recurring condition, like gravity. The phrase, "kingship was lowered from heaven," repeats after the flood, as if describing the reinstallation of a lost principle. To the Sumerian mind, history does not evolve, it restarts. The list is less a chronicle and more a periodic table of civilization. If you read these names carefully, Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana, they sound alien, agglutinative, detached from later Semitic patterns. Linguistically, they form an isolate, roots with no known relatives. Each name is a fossil, a linguistic relic that resists translation. Some philologists note that the prefix "n" denotes lord or ruler, across both divine and mortal domains, implying no boundary between the two. This ambiguity is intentional. The first kings were never strictly men. They occupy a grammatical twilight in their own language. Now, imagine the psychological weight of such inheritance. You are a citizen of Lagash or Uruk, living in mud-brick walls that crumble with each season. You attend rituals where otherworldly kings are named, their reigns intoned like astronomical equations. These were not legends to you, they were infrastructural truths. Civilization existed because it had been once before. The temples were restorations, the measurements of irrigation, architecture, and calendars were not discoveries, they were recoveries. Modern historians often marvel at how Sumer seems to emerge abruptly, fully literate, administratively organized, mathematically competent. There is no gradual learning curve visible in the archaeological record, just appearance. That abruptness mirrors the very story Sumer told of itself. The first civilization remembered itself not as a beginning, but as a resumption. The King List becomes its theological license. Authority did not evolve, it returned. And yet, the document never explains what came before the flood in moral terms. There is no sin, no transgression, only discontinuity. The silence in the clay is not punitive, it is systemic. Something was interrupted, something that might have transcended biology or even humanity's cognitive capacity. The anti-human kings, as some later interpreters dubbed them, were embodiments of a pre-human order, perhaps metaphorical, perhaps mathematical, existing only to maintain equilibrium between earth and sky. Under this interpretation, their reigns become durations of stability, epochs when heavens and earth were synchronized through ritual measurement. The flood then marks desynchronization, a celestial reset. And the re-lowering of kingship after the flood represents the fragile realignment attempted by human hands. In this sense, the King List is not history. It is a calibration log written in clay. Hold that thought for a moment. If civilization functions as a restoration rather than an invention, what does that imply about us? Are we innovators or merely rememberers of something we once understood, but have now reduced to myths? Every layer of clay, every fragment decoded, suggests the same pattern. Memory compressed into bureaucracy, transcendence encoded as accounting. The ancient scribe was not writing poetry. He was balancing the cosmic ledger. When you look around the modern world, the grids of cities, the numerical calendars, the ceaseless measurement of time, you are still inhabiting the logic of that list. We maintain records, we crown successors, we fear interruption. Perhaps kingship itself, in all its abstract forms of governance and control, is the human attempt to maintain continuity against the flood. The political is, in a sense, geological, a desperate will to stratify meaning before it dissolves back into entropy. The strangeness of the King List is that it does not argue, it simply lists. It bears no witness, no moral framing, no theology. Its terror lies in neutrality. It is humanity's first bureaucratic encounter with the infinite. And somewhere beneath those repetitive numbers, a single idea pulses. That the first civilizations did not arise from emptiness, but from remembrance, from fragments of a world drowned not only by water, but by forgetfulness. So when you imagine the first kings, do not see crowns and palaces. Imagine architects of alignment, custodians of an order too abstract to survive uncorrupted. Imagine their disappearance not as death, but as deactivation. And imagine now that every city still writes its own king list. Each war, each restoration, each foundation as echoes of that first descent of order onto chaos. The clay prism whispers as you turn it in the light. The wedge marks shine faintly like the remains of stars. There, in that mute texture, lies the first chapter of a forgotten cosmology, a cosmology where rule, number, and memory are one. You can almost hear what it says if you listen closely enough, the whisper of kings before history spoke. It begins in silence, beneath layers of packed earth and fractured pottery, in what was once the library of a long-forgotten temple. The prism lies half-crushed, its edges dulled by centuries of compression, and yet its wedge-shaped marks remain as precise as if they were pressed yesterday. Archaeologists lifting it from the soil noted an uncanny uniformity. The the kind of regularity one expects from modern mechanical reproduction, not from the trembling hand of an ancient scribe. The object, designed to record something as vast as eternity, fits casually in the palm of a hand. The weld-blundell prism, as it is known now, should not exist in any rational chronology. Its creation demanded not only material skill, but also an abstract understanding of permanence, of the need to preserve a record capable of surviving the collapse of worlds. 4 sides, each covered in columns of cuneiform signs, shaped like the cross-section of a rotating pyramid, an object intended to be turned, not read, in a single direction. It speaks of a mind that thought cyclically, not linearly, as though recording time were an act of rotation, not progression. On its first face, the kings before the flood are listed. On the next, those who followed. It does not break the pattern, it completes it, creating a closed register of power that loops between heaven and earth. The prism's surfaces are seamless in intent, but not in tone. Each seems to echo an older, vanished source. When studied closely, the signs vary slightly in density, as if drawn from tablets written in different dialects or centuries. It is a compilation, a rationally impossible archive, condensed into a single piece of clay. Unlike myths carved into temple walls, this prism bears all the marks of bureaucracy. The signs fall into the rhythm of an accountancy document: reigns, durations, capitals, successors. Yet the data it contains disrupts the logic that produced it. There are no reigns measured in human years, no dynasties that could ever physically exist. The clerical tone only magnifies the contradiction. It is the voice of an accountant measuring infinity. Imagine the scene of its creation. In the vast administrative complex of Larsa or Nippur, rows of scribes catalogued lists, coefficients, and inventories. Among them, one worked on this prism, not as a mythographer, but as a record keeper of the cosmic past. The same reed used to record rations of barley was now tasked with enumerating the lifespans of celestial kings. He pressed symbols for numbers so vast that they overflowed the clay's physical capacity for meaning. Yet he continued, because his purpose was not comprehension, it was preservation. Those wedges of clay served as both memory and warning. To the scribe, the prism was not an artifact, but a stabilizer. The very act of inscribing allowed the reassertion of order over chaos. The simplicity of its geometry, the 4 rectangular faces tapering to a soft apex, suggests an understanding of symmetry beyond decoration. It mimics the ziggurat, the artificial mountain bridging heaven and earth, just as it mimics the orbit of time itself. A prism, like the heavens, refracts light, and here it refracts memory. At first glance, one could mistake it for an administrative register of routine governance. Yet its content dismantles that notion. After each vast royal span, the phrase, "Then the flood swept over," appears like a ceremonial break. Removing the poetry that might have softened its blow, the flood here becomes an entry in an account book, a bureaucratic apocalypse. This dissonance between form and content gives the prism its eerie sovereignty. It is not myth masquerading as record, it is record masquerading as myth. Modern researchers who examined the prism under magnification found small irregularities in stroke density that suggested it was copied from earlier exemplars. The signs carry minute inconsistencies, the linguistic equivalent of genetic drift. That means the list was not invented in a single generation. It was replicated across centuries like a liturgical code whose original meaning had been forgotten, but whose structure demanded obedience. The Sumerians were not creating history, they were maintaining a protocol. Protocol implies authority, and authority implies origin. The origin of this directive lies in the phrase repeated across the text: kingship was lowered from heaven. It is not a moral claim but a procedural one, a description of transmission. Something once established above was made to descend below, just as the prism's physical form narrows from broad base to thin apex. Each line of the prism repeats this descent metaphor silently, its architecture embodying the very concept of vertical inheritance. That inheritance, however, was not without distortion. The reign lengths, measured in tens of thousands, were not arbitrary. They align closely with multiples of 3,600, the Sumerian Sar, a mathematical unit tied to their base 60 system. 3,600 years equals one great cycle, or a perfect square of 60. In modern terms, such a number resonates with astronomical patterns, the precession of equinoxes, orbital harmonies, sidereal years. The prism, therefore, encodes duration not as calendar time but as cosmic geometry. One face of the prism names 8 kings before the flood. The next enumerates those after. The alternation mimics the doubling pattern of binary logic: before and after, divine and mortal, memory and reconstruction. To the ancient mind, this was redundancy through rotation, a safeguard encoded within the object itself. By turning it, one restored balance. By reading it clockwise or counterclockwise, one reenacted descent and return. The prism is more than message, it is mechanism. What is extraordinary and profoundly unsettling is its bureaucratic neutrality. The text does not speculate about motives or divine justice. Its power lies in omission. The anonymous scribe who pressed the final sign took no credit, added no invocation, left no personal name. In that anonymity, an entire civilization speaks without voice. The prism becomes an object of collective memory, human hands transmitting divine silence. Imagine coming upon it now, under the sterile light of a museum case. Its colour is a dull brown grey, its edges nicked by time. At first it resembles debris, but the closer you look, the clearer the intention becomes. Every column ruled, every name placed with geometric discipline. It feels less like an artifact unearthed and more like an instruction left. The fingerprints frozen in the clay, perhaps from the very artisan who shaped it, appear around the bottom edge. They are reminders that even the bureaucrats of eternity had hands that trembled. The staggering thing about the prism is its completion. It does not leave room for narrative. Unlike the myths preserved on other tablets, it offers no introduction, no moral, no ending. It is total. This finality unnerves scholars because human history rarely closes so perfectly. We expect gaps, erasures, the usual decay of time. Yet the prism contains the totality of a system, from ascent to flood to reascent, bound together in unbroken clay. Beneath its surface, the microfractures speak of pressure, geological as much as symbolic. Thousands of years of burial imprinted tiny veins across its body, like a second text the earth wrote over the first. Reading it now, we face two histories, the one carved by humans and the one carved by soil. The artifact itself has become palimpsest, a merging of intention and erosion. The message survives not through preservation, but through endurance. The prism's discovery in the early 20th century might appear accidental, but perhaps it was inevitable. Every era rediscovers what it most needs to fear. The industrial age that found it believed in progress as the natural law of civilization. The prism refuted that belief. In its logic, progress is circular and decay inherent. The flood is not interruption, it is the interval required for restoration. Each cycle demands amnesia. That is the prism's quiet betrayal of modern faith. It holds within its small body a mathematics of forgetting. What it documents is the inevitability of recurrence, the compression of time into predictable waves. Its numerical patterns whisper that no age is original, that civilization itself is a variable in an ancient equation repeatedly solved and erased. The kings before the flood are echoes. The kings after it, reflections. Humanity exists only in the recalibration periods between resets. And so, when you imagine the prism on the table of the archaeologist, its surfaces glimmering faintly under a lamp, you are not seeing an object of the past. You are seeing a diagram of recurrence. Every wedge pressed into its surface is a coordinate in time, intersecting cycles terrestrial and cosmic. It does not simply record kings, it records the periodic reassertion of order itself. Its existence insists upon the memory of something older than language, older than civilization's self-awareness. Perhaps that is why holding its replica still produces discomfort. It feels too deliberate, too knowing, as if its language were designed not to be read, but to be recognized. The prism is an anachronism in every timeline, a piece too precise for its supposed epoch, suggesting inheritance rather than invention. Each of its surfaces reflects the same quiet impossibility, the synchronization of heaven and administration. When you stand before it, you are drawn into its geometry. 4 faces, 1 axis, name, reign, city, flood. The same cycle repeated again and again like a mantra of civilization, and at its core, empty space, nothing inside. The prism was designed not as container but as conduit, the void within acting as echo chamber for the words inscribed outside. It is the physical embodiment of an idea, that the substance of kingship is absence, an authority inherited from a past so remote it no longer requires justification. In that void you may hear something, not sound exactly, but resonance, the vibration of ancient arithmetic passing through millennia, reaching us as unease. The weld-blundell prism should not exist because it demonstrates an impossible synthesis. Myth, quantified, memory measured, eternity itemized. And yet it does exist, its clay still intact, its meaning still whispering through the gaps of understanding. If the first chapter of civilization was written as a whisper, then this object is the whisper made solid. It stands as proof that the earliest accountants did not only count food or tribute, they counted time itself, and in doing so, ensured that even the gods could be audited. At first, the numbers seem absurd. 43,200 years for one reign, 28,800 for another, 36,000 for a third. You read them twice to make sure they are not transcription errors, exaggerations, or later mythic insertions. But each numeral is deliberate, carved with care, aligned within the columns of the prism without any indication of rhetorical flourish. The Sumerian King List is austere, mathematical, and uncompromising, as if it does not ask you to believe, it only asks you to calculate. Those figures are not random. They are all divisible by 60, the sacred base of Sumerian arithmetic, the foundation of their sexagesimal system. To the Sumerians, 60 was not merely a number, it was an architecture of reality, a framework through which the heavens could be ordered. The same logic that measured the sky also measured kingship. Their mathematics did not separate the divine from the temporal. Both obeyed ratio, scale, and harmonic recurrence. A king's lifespan, therefore, could represent something far beyond biology. The 8 antediluvian kings named on the prism add up to a total of 241,200 years. Such precision mocks coincidence. No culture inflates by arithmetic accident. This total, when divided through base 60 progressions, yields values that align with astronomical cycles, sidereal rotations, lunar nodal precessions, intersections of Venus and Jupiter across millennia. The list reads almost like a coded register of cosmic synchronization mistaken for genealogy. Perhaps these kings were not men at all, but metaphorical expressions of cosmic rulers, epochs personified through administrative language. Yet the Sumerians never hint at metaphor. The tone remains technical. They record reigns the way we record fiscal years, with confidence that what they describe corresponds to actual experience, and so we must reconsider what reign meant to them. It may not refer to individual rulers, but to phases of stability, the ordered spans between catastrophic fluctuations. In their worldview, kingship was less about personality and more about alignment between the Earth's rhythm and the stars' precession. Imagine then that each king represents a stabilization period, an alignment preserved through ritual geometry and collective obedience. Alulim reigns for 43,200 years, perhaps meaning 43,200 units of cosmic order before its disruption. Each subsequent king inherits not power, but calibration. A society that viewed its ruler as a harmonizer, not a monarch, would naturally measure him in cosmic intervals, not lifespans. Their king was a tuning fork resonating with heaven's frequencies. Modern minds recoil at such magnitudes because they violate our temporal sensibilities. We live by decimals, not harmonics. But the Sumerians counted differently. Their mathematics were cyclical, built to mirror astronomical motion. In such a system, large numbers do not represent exaggeration, but completion. Each 1,000 or multiple of 60 described a closed circle, the return of a celestial alignment to its beginning. To describe a rule of 43,200 years was to describe the completion of 12 great cycles, the return of the heavens to their original configuration after eons of motion. Archaeologists, hesitant to accept these implications, labeled the figures mythic. But myths do not maintain consistent ratios. Myths expand, distort, contradict. The King List does none of those things. Its numbers are as precise as an engineer's blueprint. The inscription is not poetic. It is formulaic. To dismiss its figures as exaggerations is to misunderstand the intent. It is as if one mocked the digits of pi for being too long. The list's purpose was preservation, not persuasion. One might ask what kind of society could conceive of time on such an inhuman scale. The answer hides in the clay itself. To the Sumerians, clay was not inert. It was living matter capable of holding eternity. Once inscribed, a number became a permanent structure of thought. Through those numbers, they domesticated the infinite. Whether they believed the kings lived that long or that cosmic rhythms demanded such intervals does not matter. Either way, they encoded the continuity of civilization against oblivion. Consider that these figures bridge narratives across cataclysm. Before the flood, kings reign for tens of thousands of years. After it, reigns shrink to hundreds, sometimes tens. Something monumental changed, not just geologically, but conceptually. The universe had cooled, its harmonies shortened, its stability diminished. Time itself had thickened. What we perceive as progress might have felt to them like cosmic contraction, the slow dying of resonance. This reduction of reign lengths after the flood might not indicate realism gained, but energy lost. The kingly age of giants and mathematic immortals gave way to the fragile age of men. By compressing eternity into time, humanity accepted mortality as tax for continuity. The King List's decline in duration is thus not history's maturation, it is its exhaustion. Civilization becomes smaller, more practical, and infinitely less harmonious. Still, a question lingers. How could numbers so vast survive through textual tradition without distortion? The answer may lie in the Sumerians' obsession with repetition. Every student scribe copied canonical tablets repeatedly until mastery, thereby ensuring genomic precision across centuries. Their system perpetuated stability through redundancy. Think of their schools as engines of replication, not invention. Their world prized memory above imagination, safety above novelty. In such a world, numbers became oaths. Each repetition reaffirmed the cosmos in miniature. From a linguistic perspective, the Sumerian word for king, lugal, means literally great man, but also embodiment of the cosmic order. The dual definition implies that rulership extended far beyond governance. To be king was to act as the conduit sustaining the frequency of heaven on earth. For that reason, durations of reign encoded more than human tenure. They expressed cosmic resonance maintained through ritual. When that resonance was lost, reign ended and chaos returned. Imagine now a civilization that treated mathematics as prayer, numbers as liturgy. Every calculation became sacrament. Under such logic, one does not die at 43,200 years. One stabilizes that interval and then yields it forward. The term reign thus mirrors both administrative continuity and numerical sanctity. Human kings may have lasted a handful of generations, but the symbolic kingship remained unbroken, bridging flood and flame through arithmetic fidelity. Some scholars speculate that the enormous numbers represent aggregates, entire dynastic periods measured as one continuous regime. Yet even that explanation cannot account for the uniform proportionality to 60. The persistence of that ratio throughout every entry suggests intention. It also suggests memory of an older clock, perhaps celestial, whose revolutions were once visible enough to mark time before even agriculture settled the plains of Mesopotamia. The Sumerians might have been describing epochs humans merely inherited rather than lived. The text's simplicity conceals its metaphysical daring. In stating Alulim ruled 43,200 years, it refuses to distinguish between chronology and cosmology. It presumes continuity between them. Under such assumption, the reign of a king equals the lifespan of an era, the expression of cosmic balance at human scale. To question the length of that rule would have seemed as foolish as questioning the sunrise. Time was a ritual, not a measurement. Now imagine reading those names by torchlight in a subterranean archive, where the humidity of the river air smells faintly of clay and decay. You trace each wedge, counting silently, realizing these are not figments but equations. You realize that even now, millennia later, the ratios still align, astronomical periods still mirror Sumerian multiples. It is as though the cosmos itself kept faith with its oldest administrators. However strange their figures appear, their core intuition remains intact. Civilization is harmonic only when its measures echo the heavens. That idea that governance equals resonance explains why later empires replicated the same obsession. Egypt measured dynasties by astronomical decades. China tracked reigns through celestial animals. Even modern calendars echo these cycles, converting cosmic harmonies into bureaucratic terms. Somewhere in the marrow of human civilization lies the instinct to encode infinity into management. The King List simply formalized it first. But therein lies the dread. Because if those durations truly align with long-forgotten cycles, then our brief modern centuries may represent mere aftershocks of larger recurrences. The flood that ended the first 8 reigns was not unique. It was cyclical. Each sequence of kings might mark the completion of an inevitable astronomical catastrophe. The enormous numbers are not boasts, they are countdowns. 43,000 years until collapse, 28,000 until correction. The list may not recount history, it may warn it. If you accept that possibility, the prism stops being ancient and becomes immediate. It transforms from curiosity to clock. Each figure becomes a measure of time between resets, eras of calm between inundations of memory. That would explain the mathematical precision, the cold neutrality, the absence of drama. The Sumerians did not worship their kings, they audited them. They calculated stability in units vast enough to shame eternity, because they had already seen how fragile continuity was. The anti-human durations, therefore, are not illusions, but markers of scale incomprehensible to modern minds. They measure civilization not as progress, but as recurrence. The king becomes a placeholder in the great equation of being, his reign the stable interval before the next deluge of forgetting. And when the final number dissolves into silence, history resets, awaiting some future scribe to press it back into clay and begin again. So, when we read those impossible figures, we should hear them not as exaggeration, but as echo. They are the residual frequencies of an older world vibrating faintly beneath ours. Each number, however vast, points toward an awareness Sumer never lost, that history is not a straight line but a long wave folding back upon itself. The Sumerian kings did not reign for 43,000 years because they were immortal. They reigned because the heavens for a time stood still, and the world below believed it could, too. There is a single line in the Sumerian King List that divides all of history in two. Then the flood swept over. It is minimal, bureaucratic, and without ornament. No explanation is given, no moral appended, no divine anger invoked. Yet that line is the silent hinge of civilization, the point at which the very concept of time fractures and begins anew. What kind of memory can compress catastrophe into 5 calm words? Perhaps the answer lies not in mythology but in observation. The people of the southern Mesopotamian plains lived in perpetual negotiation with water. Each year, the Tigris and Euphrates rose, swallowing fields, remapping borders, redrawing the geometry of existence. But beneath the ritual predictability of flooding lay the collective trauma of a flood that did not recede, a surge that erased the map entirely. Their scribes, inheritors of survival, turned that extinction into syntax. The flood in the King List does not merely destroy cities, it resets legitimacy. Kingship is lowered from heaven once before, withdrawn, then lowered again after. This is not punishment, it is calibration. The divine order reboots, seeding new dynasties into clay. To the ancients, the flood was the world's memory purge, both mourning and restoration coded into the same act. Water, which brings fertility, also bears oblivion. It nourishes and erases with the same gesture. Consider the archaeological confirmation hidden within Earth itself. Deep beneath the ancient city of excavators encountered a solid stratum of river clay, nearly 4 feet thick, sterile of artifacts perfectly interposed between 2 layers of civilization. Within it, the remnants of reeds and shells were compacted like trapped breath. Above that layer, new cities appeared with new languages, new gods, new order. Below it, silence. The sediment is the geological equivalent of that one line from the list. This dual evidence, a text and a layer of mud, merges myth with stratigraphy. It transforms literature into sediment and sediment into memory. To call one myth and the other fact is to misunderstand their unity. The flood is both literal and symbolic because it served as both. The ancients did not divide physical from metaphysical. A river could drown bodies and reset cosmic epochs simultaneously. In their worldview, matter carried meaning as naturally as it carried silt. Imagine standing on the banks of that ancient river, hearing its slow thunder roll over the plain. The people knew that the river was older than their gods. They built canals to tame it, ziggurats to rise above it, and tablets to remember what it took away. But on some unimaginable night, the water ignored the boundaries, pouring over everything human. Temples dissolved. Clay archives turned to slurry. When the world dried, humanity had to choose what to remember. They chose to remember their kings. The flood's insertion into the King List was therefore not an editorial accident. It was the central act of human recollection. Everything that came before was antediluvian, written in the language of gods and numbers. Everything after was post-diluvian, written in the syntax of men and cities. The difference is not technological but ontological. Before the flood, time belonged to the cosmos. After it, time belonged to the record. What makes that rupture profound is how clinically it is stated. There are no moral judgments, no lamentations. The text moves on immediately to the names of new kings, as if nothing happened, as if annihilation were part of standard administration. That detachment is chilling because it hints at repetition. It implies that the flood was not a unique calamity but an expected event, a reset already built into the operating system of civilization. Water had been the auditor, and it would return when balance broke again. The silence within the clay mirrors this logic. Every archaeologist who has brushed dust from a preserved flood layer feels its strange serenity. A disaster should look chaotic, but this one is uniform, as though poured with deliberate precision. The world did not explode, it drowned gracefully, evenly. This composure seeps into the text itself. The Sumerians did not scream into their tablets, they exhaled. Their restraint transformed terror into law. To them, history's true beginning was not invention, but return. After the flood, kingship descended again. The phrase suggests continuity, a restoration of a suspended order, not creation ex nihilo. The survivors saw themselves not as founders, but as restorers of an ancient equilibrium. Civilization was resurrected, not born. Here lies one of the earliest forms of collective amnesia disguised as continuity, the illusion that recovery equals progress. Imagine the atmosphere of those first years after the flood. The soil was fertile but haunted. Every mound could conceal the bones of the old world. The survivors must have rebuilt with a strange mixture of reverence and fear, knowing that the same waters that allowed crops to grow could rise again. Each brick laid in new cities like Kish or Uruk was a votive offering against recurrence. To build was to plead, to measure was to remember. They memorialized the catastrophe through precision. Their city plans followed geometric proportions tied to stellar coordinates. Their temples mirrored constellations. Their rituals summoned the same cosmic forces that had once annihilated them, this time to harness rather than obey. The flood reshaped not only soil but consciousness. Humanity's relationship with the divine shifted from worship to management, from awe to administration. The King List embodies that transformation perfectly. Gods no longer speak, they are summarized. This act of summarizing divinity is itself unsettling. It signals the birth of abstraction, the moment humanity learned to quantify transcendence. Before the flood, cosmic beings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, humans inherited only fractions of that harmony. Reigns in hundreds, eventually in tens. Time contracted, and with it, imagination. The infinite was reduced to ledger entries. The divine bureaucracy became human bureaucracy. Civilization learned to imitate the gods through paperwork. Yet embedded within this bureaucratic tone is grief. The calm finality of "then the flood swept over" reads like an epitaph written by someone who has forgotten the faces of the dead, but still feels their absence. It is a memory fossilized into routine language. That grief persists not in words but in structure. The way the text divides history without fanfare, the way every subsequent dynasty feels like an after-image. Each human reign is a smaller echo of what came before, as if history were attempting to refill a vessel forever shattered. To modern sensibilities, the flood seems mythic because its scale defies measurement. But geologically, stratified floods have destroyed civilizations repeatedly. What distinguishes the Sumerian record is its inescapable clarity. They did not frame it as punishment or chaos. They framed it as boundary. In doing so, they created the first historical concept of before and after. The flood became time's 0 point, the origin of our chronology by destruction, not Genesis. Pause on that paradox. Civilization begins where civilization ends. The first historians wrote not to celebrate life but to document its interruption. The flood serves as a calendar rupture, a scar that becomes measure. Every date written since is an act of recovery from that wound. When we mark years, anniversaries, or geological eras, we are unconsciously echoing the Sumerian instinct to count from catastrophe. In the centuries that followed, echoes of this flood would ripple outward into Akkadian myths, Hebrew scriptures, and even Greek philosophies. But the Sumerians spoke first, and their version was the coldest. There is no hero here, no surviving family aboard a vessel, no animals 2 by 2. Only administration and resumption, kingship lowered again, a new list commencing. What survived was not humanity's innocence, but its bureaucracy. Viewed this way, the flood was not a tragedy. It was doctrine. It proved that order could be destroyed and reconstituted, that memory could drown yet remain legible in clay. It also whispered a deeper fatalism. If the flood had come once, it would come again. The compact between heaven and earth was cyclical, not eternal. Every reign carried the implicit threat of renewal through annihilation. Water had become the punctuation mark ending and beginning history alike. Perhaps that is why the King List ends its prelude in silence. The line, "Then the flood swept over," is not closure. It is an inhalation before speech resumes. Afterward, time contracts, numbers shrink, and names multiply. Humanity has learned humility, but also cunning. They no longer seek eternity, they manage intervals. The divine timetable has become a royal charter. The gods are accountants now, and water is their ink. The flood, both literal and conceptual, built the foundation of historical consciousness. It sculpted the dividing wall between myth and record, between heavenly rhythm and human time. The Sumerians, in encoding that fracture so cleanly, gave the world its first calendar of loss. Every successor culture, knowingly or not, has inherited that structure, the urge to rebuild after dissolution, to measure continuity by what interrupts it. So the flood continues, even without water. It manifests through empire collapse, through forgotten languages, through every archive left unread until rediscovered centuries later. Each rediscovery is its own receding tide, revealing the ruins beneath new silt. The Sumerian flood was not a singular event. It was a principle. It was the universe pausing to reset its own equilibrium, while humanity learned for the first time that memory is the only thing that can drown and still whisper afterward. The Sumerian King List opens with a declaration that is both plain and blasphemous. Kingship was lowered from heaven. Those 5 words overturn every modern assumption about the birth of government. They propose not invention, not evolution, but descent, an authority that fell rather than rose. Before human rulers, there were others who established the system itself, beings the text calls gods, though the tone suggests administrators, not mythic deities. The world before the flood was an age of order under divine rule, an epoch when boundaries between heaven and earth were porous. The gods governed cities like Eridu and Larak, not as distant creators, but as physical occupants. Their reigns were measured, listed, and itemized like any mortal successors who came later. The King List acknowledges their sovereignty in exactly the same bureaucratic manner that it records human reigns, an unsettling neutrality that collapses the sacred into the procedural. In Mesopotamian cosmology, divinity was not metaphorical. The gods were entities localized in stone, star, and flood. They existed within measurable cycles of power. Each god's residence corresponded with a celestial body. Each reign mirrored a heavenly pattern. When the list states that divine kings once ruled, it is not implying myth. It is asserting correlation. The sky and the earth once operated in sync, their rotations governing both biology and bureaucracy. Imagine the ancient night sky over the southern plains. No pollution, no haze. Every star visible in precise geometry. For the Sumerians, those stars were not passive. They were governors signaling through light. The gods descending might therefore describe not creatures arriving from space, but constellations crossing the horizon, stars becoming visible after vast intervals. Their descent was astronomical, their governance celestial mechanics misunderstood as history. But there is another, darker possibility. The uniform tone of the King List, the lack of wonder, suggests that the descent was observed, not imagined. The phrase, lowered from heaven, appears procedural, as if documenting a known event, the arrival of a structure, a principle, perhaps even physical beings that established the order humanity would later mimic. If so, the King List is not a mythic memory, but a maintenance log from a transitional age between 2 species of rule. Certain linguistic clues deepen the unease. The Sumerian word for heaven, an, means more than sky. It denotes height, enclosure, and authority. To lower kingship from heaven is therefore to transfer governing architecture, a system, from one domain to another. This means the King List might describe not a divine bestowal, but a technological or structural import. The gods did not choose to rule. They installed something. Humanity's later kings only inherited a software already written. The divine kings governed cities that themselves sound like coordinates in lost geometry. Eridu, the first listed city, means mighty place, or faraway home. Its ziggurat was aligned not with local geography but with stars of the southern sky. Archaeologists have found evidence of water channels beneath its foundations, suggesting an attempt to merge architecture with hydraulic systems, technology indistinguishable from theology. The ruling gods, then, could be interpreted as early engineers, architects of order encoded into built environments. Their reign lengths, as we have seen, are vast, tens of thousands of years, too long for bloodlines and too precise for legend. They correspond not to human lives, but to cosmic measures, perhaps recording synchronization of planetary bodies. The ancient scribes, inheriting fragments of older memory, called these forces gods because no other category existed. In that sense, the King List preserves a language for non-human agency, the vocabulary of power before anthropocentrism. To stand in those cities now, Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak, is to stand amid foundations that look human but feel alien. The bricks are proportioned mathematically, the temples oriented to celestial coordinates with an accuracy contemporary instruments only recently confirmed. These were not accidental alignments. They formed a communication network between earth and sky, architecture as antenna. The Sumerians were participants, not architects. They inherited instruction and preserved it through ritual repetition. Consider the emotional residue of that inheritance. Imagine living in a world whose governing system originated elsewhere, handed down by beings larger, longer-lived, and more precise than yourself. Every ritual you perform, every law you obey, is an imitation of their design. Their language, the earliest cuneiform, retains traces of syntax so foreign that even today full translation is impossible. In that grammar, verbs contain directionality. Actions go downward from higher to lower, never upward. The cosmos itself spoke hierarchically. The gods' withdrawal is as mysterious as their arrival. The King List simply notes the end of their reigns, with bureaucratic finality, no explanation, no rebellion. One day gods ruled, the next, humans resumed authority. Between those lines lies a silence louder than apocalypse. What could end such reigns except the flood itself, a planetary reset washing away the residue of a non-human presence? When the waters receded, humanity rebuilt, guided by lingering instructions encoded in ritual and measurement. If you reimagine these descended gods as custodians of cosmic cycles, their disappearance marks the loss of synchronization between heaven and earth. Humanity inherited a broken interface, a governance system missing its operators. The flood thus becomes more than natural disaster. It is the point of disconnection. Afterward, humans rule alone, maintaining the empty throne through ceremony, forever reenacting a synchronization they no longer understand. Some scholars suggest these divine rulers represent ancestral dynasties mythologized over time, memories of ancient elites whose technologies seemed supernatural. Yet this hypothesis fails to explain the consistency of astronomical references, the mathematical ratios embedded in their durations, the precision of their city alignments. The King List's language resists metaphor. It wants to be documentary. Its dryness betrays authenticity, not art. Perhaps these gods never meant to be worshipped. Perhaps they were custodians of stability, mechanists of a broader system of harmony whose maintenance required energy, observation, and intervention. When their epoch ended, whether through catastrophe or completion, the system went dormant. Humanity, alone and terrified, deified the memory of its operators. The temples that followed became service stations for an absent machinery. Worship is maintenance without understanding. The phrase, lowered from heaven, repeats at the moment of restoration after the flood. This suggests cyclic return rather than permanent ascension or exile. The text implies that cosmic authority re-emerges whenever humanity reaches sufficient instability. A principle, not a species, descends, an algorithm of order correcting human chaos. The gods are functions of equilibrium. They do not rule out of mercy, but necessity. When the world drifts, the pattern reinstalls itself. Imagine the psychological effect on early survivors of the flood. They rediscover the sky, raw and indifferent, no longer synchronized. The old stars have shifted, precessed. Calibration is lost. Into this void comes the memory that once skies and kings interlocked perfectly. The first rulers after the flood, human kings like Jusha of Kish, are mere placeholders, governing not with divine presence, but with divine absence. Their power is measured by how well they imitate eternity using fragile human materials. It is tempting to interpret the divine descent as mythic instruction, a story told to justify kings by linking them to gods. But the text's severity argues against propaganda. It documents without persuasion. No theology frames it, no hymn exalts it. The tone remains deadpan, as if the scribes themselves no longer grasped what their words implied. They copied a transmission older than their comprehension, like accountants recording an ancient formula whose terms had lost semantic charge. The pattern of descent and withdrawal may even mirror geological and astronomical rhythms. Civilizations rise during periods of climatic harmony and collapse during chaos. The reappearance of kingship could mark the restoration of environmental equilibrium or cosmic order, the planet's recurring synchronization with its own cycles. In that interpretation, the gods become metaphors for equilibrium itself, invisible but essential regulators restoring cosmic accounting whenever entropy accumulates. Still, the language's peculiar concreteness refuses full abstraction. It insists on descent as event, not metaphor. Something came down. Something established patterns of rule, numbers, geometry, and moral law. The King List does not say they inspired kingship. It says they delivered it. The verb is mechanical. Authority lands, installs, operates, withdraws. The universe becomes administrative. The gods, then, were not creators, but auditors. They inspected the order of the earth and left behind their paperwork. Across every later civilization, echoes of their descent repeat. Egyptian gods arrive by boat through celestial waters. Mesoamerican deities descend on ladders of flame. In Greek memory, the age of gods ruling among men precedes the flood of Deucalion. These are all distant reverberations of one Sumerian formula. Authority falls from above. Humanity in every era translates cosmic hierarchy into local control. The gods stopped appearing, but their logic continued through thrones and empires. What remains disturbing is the dispassionate tone with which the scribes describe the crossing. Divinity becoming administrative fact suggests that the most sacred patterns might survive only through accounting. The King List's theology is not prayer, it is protocol. The descent of gods is the origin not of religion, but of governance. To rule in Sumerian understanding is to perpetuate the structure of heaven using the clay of earth. The gap between sacred and secular had not yet opened. Power was literal. And perhaps that is the hidden warning encoded within the clay. If kingship descends cyclically, if order itself is imposed rather than generated, then human civilization remains permanently subject to recall. The gods, whatever they were, may return not with fire or judgment, but with quietly reinstated symmetry. The sky will realign, the rivers will change course, and some future scribes will again press into wet clay that kingship was lowered from heaven. It will not feel like revelation. It will feel like procedure. Of all the enigmas within the Sumerian King List, none is as elegantly unsettling as its use of mathematics. The numbers inscribed on the weld-blundell prism are not random exaggerations, but exact multiples of 60, an ancient cipher encoded in clay. If one examines those colossal reign lengths, 43,200, 28,800, 36,000, they resolve not into chaos, but into harmony. Hidden beneath their apparent absurdity lies an older kind of precision, the mathematics of immortality. The Sumerians did not conceive of numbers as mere quantities. Numbers were living principles, nodes of divine resonance. 60 was not 60. It was completion, containing within it the echoes of lunar cycles, solar years, and geometric perfect squares. Through this base 60 architecture, time itself became a harmonized structure, divisible without remainder across celestial motions. The King List is therefore not historical narrative, but harmonic equation, where the duration of a reign is the measure of a cosmic chord. Their sexagesimal system, counting by 60s instead of 10s, offered an impossible versatility. It could subdivide evenly into halves, thirds, quarters, and more, aligning mathematical rhythm with the symmetry observed in stars and tides. For the Sumerian mind, precision was holiness, divisibility was purity. When they measured reigns in thousands of years, they were not exaggerating, but aligning the rhythm of heaven to the tempo of governance. Each king's duration represented a completed cycle rather than a lifespan. Consider the number 43,200. Divided by 60, it yields 720, exactly the product of 12 multiplied by 60, a sacred configuration linking the 12 constellations to the full circle of time. To our modern eye, it seems coincidence. To theirs, it was proof of divine calibration. These reign lengths describe an astronomical poetry written in numeric code, a bridge between orbit and decree. Their kings ruled not only territory, but synchronization itself. It was this obsession with number that allowed Sumer to create the first calendars, the first geometries, the first records of compound interest. Every dimension of material life, tax, architecture, even ritual, followed arithmetic derived from the patterns of planets. In that sense, their mathematics was not invention, but revelation. To count was to participate in divine logic. The King List represents that logic fossilized, a relic of an age when mathematics still carried metaphysical weight. Imagine a Sumerian scribe bending over his tablet, reed stylus poised. His goal is not computation in the modern sense. He writes numbers like prayers. The gesture of recording becomes act of devotion. For him, the digits 43,200 do not describe years. They conjure balance. Writing them is equivalent to reasserting the world's geometry. The tablet, therefore, is not historical chronicle, but talismanic recalibration. When read through this lens, the list acquires new dimension. Each name and number correspond to frequencies, the rulers, as harmonic markers within the grand equation of time. The pre-flood rulers are intervals of perfection, representing the era when earth and sky operated in phase. The post-flood rulers, with their diminished spans, mark the decline into dissonance. Civilization becomes increasingly disharmonic, a measure of how far humanity drifts from the cosmic metronome. For the Sumerian mathematician-priest, sexagesimal numbers were music. They believed that the heavens, like a vast lyre, vibrated in measurable ratios. The measure of a king's reign corresponded to one of these tones. Thus, A ruler was not merely sovereign, but note, his duration the resonance of order expressed through governance. When the note fell out of tune, instability, famine, or flood followed. Rule was therefore not political, but acoustic. The harmony of the cosmos required constant retuning. This view of mathematics as sacred discipline explains why so many Sumerian structures are bound to astronomical alignments. Their ziggurats shadow the solstices precisely. Their courtyards divide into perfect rectangles, their altars arranged according to geometric ratios of 3-4-5, the earliest known approximation of a Pythagorean triple. These sequences are not coincidence. They are expressions of resonance. Every brick was placed according to a numerical prayer. To live within such symmetry was to inhabit eternity made habitable. The King List's numerical strangeness mirrors this architectural order. It encodes what might be called temporal geometry, a lattice of time proportioned like Sumerian temples. Each reign is an axis, each flood a reset of harmonics. The tablet is not storytelling, but engineering, a schematic of duration. When the Sumerian astrologers spoke of kings ruling for tens of thousands of years, they described coherence, not chronology. To decode their arithmetic is to step into a logic alien to us. Their base 60 system dissolves the boundaries between mathematics and myth. 60 forms the foundation of their minutes and hours, their degrees of a circle, their entire conception of recurrence. Even now, modern timekeeping inherits that impulse. Every clock, divided into 60 seconds and 60 minutes, is an unintentional shrine to Sumer. We live inside the time grid they once equated with cosmic law. The perfection of 60 held meaning beyond calculation. It symbolized wholeness because it contains all divisors from 1 to 6. It harmonized simplicity with multiplicity, the one and the many. To base civilization upon such a number was to declare that society itself must mirror universal ratios. Every field, every palace, every reign obeyed the same proportional truth. Governance functioned as geometry extended into law. The King List becomes the constitution of math itself. Some linguists argue that the enormous reign lengths may encode astronomical cycles such as the Great Year, the full precession of equinoxes over roughly 25,900 years. Multiples of 60 converge astonishingly close to those values. If true, then the King List was an astronomical record disguised as genealogy. Each king represented a completed sky cycle, and the flood, the break in sequence, represented cosmic reset, perhaps the slow tilt of heaven realigning its axis. Even the flood itself obeys numeric logic. In Sumerian myth, the deluge occurs after 8 kings and 241,200 years. 8, the number of completion in early Mesopotamian numerology, symbolized restoration of balance after chaos. The flood, then, was the natural closure of a cosmic equation, an inevitable clearing of accumulated error. Sumerian cosmology was recursive. Perfection produces dissonance. Dissonance triggers correction. Correction restores perfection. Mathematics was morality inscribed in clay. This morality extended into human memory. Each copy of the King List replicated its proportions with obsessive accuracy. Unlike myths rewritten to please new dynasties, the numbers remained untouched. Copyists risked divine punishment if they altered a single value. The arithmetic was sacred law, not narrative choice. This commitment made mathematics into theology's skeleton, the framework sustaining millennia of belief in divine order measurable by ratio. Consider the psychological comfort of such certainty. If the universe operates according to number, then chaos becomes calculable, catastrophe a process of correction, not punishment. Humans cease to be victims of the unknown and become participants in maintenance of equilibrium. Mathematics substitutes fear with structure. The gods remain, but as equations. The Sumerian found peace in the thought that the cosmos, though vast and unpredictable, was still a ledger to be balanced. But there is also horror in such precision. To live in a numerically quantized world is to dwell without mystery, bound to perpetual accounting. Every event becomes predictable, every anomaly a deviation demanding correction. The King List's unyielding logic implies fatalism. If the numbers embody heaven's ratios, then even destruction follows formula. The flood, the fall, the rise, all are sequenced. Freedom dissolves in recurrence. Immortality, under arithmetic law, is another name for repetition. This paradox makes the King List simultaneously divine and tragic. It envisions a world ruled by equation, immutable, symmetrical, exact, yet endlessly cycling through identical catastrophes. The mathematics that once promised immortality ensures monotony instead. Civilizations rise, harmonize, and drown, while the formula endures unbroken. Even in loss, Sumer remains. Its time structure continues to govern every clock, every coordinate, every rotation recorded since. The sexagesimal cipher, carved into clay, became the sine wave of history. Think about that wave extending through centuries. The minutes you count now, the degrees you measure, the seconds between your heartbeats, all descend from that same code. The Sumerians sought to inscribe perfection and instead defined our prison. Their immortality endures not through kings or gods, but through arithmetic. The ancient scribe who pressed his stylus into soft clay effectively encoded eternity into the shape of time. In that sense, the Sumerian King List stands not as artifact, but as algorithm. It documents the initial moment when mathematics colonized memory, when abstract ratio replaced narrative, when eternity adopted the grammar of administration. What remains of that moment still shapes the modern world. The tick of your watch, the rhythm of your calendar, the coordinates mapping continents, all whisper the pulse of 60. Every measurement humanity makes today is an aftertone of that first divine computation, the sexagesimal heartbeat that the Sumerians believed could outlive the gods themselves. The desert has its own language. It does not shout. It whispers through dust and wind, through the slow abrasion of stone that erases louder centuries. When the early archaeologists first crossed the plains of Mesopotamia, they were not chasing myths. They were chasing whispers. Beneath the parched surface, they expected temples and statues. Instead, they found tablets that hummed like distant static, the residue of a world that still remembered its own mathematics of eternity. The men who uncovered the Sumerian King List did not at first realize what they had found. To them, these were administrative documents, lists of names and numbers drawn up by bureaucrats devoted to civic routine. But as they brushed away the layers of earth, the patterns began to disturb them. The columns of cuneiform bore reigns stretching tens of thousands of years, etched with precision rather than imagination. What bureaucracy, they wondered, would dare to measure the impossible? Among them were scholars whose tools were simple: brushes, picks, notebooks, and patience measured in decades. Leonard Woolley, digging at during the early decades of the 20th century, worked with the quiet persistence of a librarian in a ruined archive. His trenches exposed not only architecture but philosophy. Each layer of sediment became a page of human memory, read in silence rather than sound. He later described the sensation as hearing the earth sigh between shovels. His team carefully extracted hundreds of clay fragments, recording each in catalogue numbers, unaware that they were reassembling a cosmic ledger. They unearthed not just the remnants of cities, but the mathematics of myth. One fragment carried part of a line from the King List. Another listed the flood. Yet another contained the genealogy of divine rulers before the waters came. Together, they formed the contour of a civilization obsessed with documentation as the last defense against oblivion. Imagine the atmosphere in those dig sites, the stifling heat, the smell of sun-baked clay and formalin from specimen jars, the hush when a new tablet emerged. For every discovery there was awe, but also discomfort. These were not relics of gradual cultural development. The artifacts spoke of sudden emergence, of sophistication fully formed, as if someone had switched civilization on rather than invented it. That single fact haunted even the most pragmatic archaeologists. They expected origin stories, primitive attempts at writing, crude experiments in governance, but instead found administrative completeness. Tax records, mathematical tables, legal codes, all written with bureaucratic fluency already intact. Sumer appeared not as a beginning, but as a return. The King List confirmed this suspicion with unnerving precision. Its message was clear. History had restarted. Archaeology, as A of progress, was unprepared for restoration. The silence beneath the soil spoke as loudly as the inscriptions. In some trenches, after layers of graves and pottery, came a clean wall of silt, the geological mark of a flood. Beneath it, ruins older than cities. The archaeologists' brushes slowed there. They felt the shift in the earth's texture, as if touching the cooling scar of the world's memory. Between layers, they could trace catastrophe and continuation, destruction and renewal. And above all, they sensed the quiet repetition of handwriting that seemed to continue across millennia without learning or invention, only persistence. Some of them began to question chronology itself. How could a civilization arise seemingly overnight from the debris of nothing, carrying systems of writing, law, and measurement already polished? The King List offered an answer too radical to accept, that kingship descended, not evolved. The researchers, bound by modern skepticism, disguised their astonishment under academic language. Yet privately, they admitted the eerie precision of those early records could not belong to randomness. The fragments travelled from desert trenches to museum vaults, where other scholars pieced them together. Under lamplight, differences in script told stories almost as deep as the text itself. Some strokes were harder, sharper, written by scribes accustomed to counting census tallies. Others were soft, incised with religious caution. Through their tiny variations, one could feel time vibrating across fingers, long turned to dust. Each wedge-shaped mark was the mouth of silence speaking in rhythmless language. It is said that Woolley once held a tablet between his hands and whispered that it felt strangely warm, as though the clay itself retained memory. He was not entirely wrong. Clay, unlike paper, remembers. Its density preserves the ghost of heat, the fingerprint of creation. The archaeologists, though driven by reason, confronted an object that refused to be mere artifact. The prism or tablet became intermediary, a residue of contact between human and cosmic order, between dust and divinity. Underneath the scientific reports and stratigraphic charts ran a quiet uncertainty. They uncovered facts, but the facts resisted domestication. Every artifact was an answer wrapped around a new impossibility. How had such organized data survived a flood? Who kept these numerical traditions intact through centuries of obliteration? The archaeologists followed the trail of logic only to find themselves standing at the threshold of metaphysics. The silence in their notebooks carried more weight than their interpretations. Imagine the evenings after excavation when the desert cooled and the team sat beneath flickering lamps. They catalogued fragments while wind hissed through the tents. Each piece they logged felt heavier than its weight in clay. Behind their rational tone lingered awe, a recognition that they were rearranging a message not meant for them. Some nights, according to later diaries, they stopped writing altogether and just listened to the emptiness outside, convinced that some frequencies of the past could still be heard if the air was still enough. In that stillness, the King List took on its true shape, not as document, but as echo chamber. The archaeologists realized they were not discovering the past, but reactivating it. Each deciphered name, each restored number, returned one pulse to a system momentarily dead. The flood no longer felt distant, it became method. Civilization, memory, excavation, they all followed the same rhythm. Burial, silence, rediscovery. Archaeology itself mirrored the myth it studied. To their unease, the deeper they dug, the older order appeared. Beneath the Sumerians lay the Ubaid. Beneath them, prehistoric layers aligned with no known progression. Each culture seemed inheritance rather than invention. This conflicted with the 19th century notion of human evolution as linear improvement. Yet the spade told otherwise. Civilization appeared cyclic, emerging from silence as if restored from backup each time catastrophe concluded. The King List, resting on its side in museum drawers, silently affirmed their suspicion. Back in London or Paris, the tablets became prisoners of glass cases. Scholars translated them clinically, reducing cosmic poetry into catalogue entries. Yet somewhere in the transcription, something was always lost. The rhythm of the cuneiform could not be maintained. The silence of clay could not be printed. Those who had touched the originals noticed the absence most. Written reports record rational conclusions, but their dreams recorded something stranger, the feeling that the ground beneath their feet was not past but memory still unfolding. More than once they encountered near-identical texts, separated by wide geographical distances. Fragments from Nippur mirrored slabs from Lhasa. Two cities centuries apart, yet inscribed with near-perfect correspondence. Such replication implied more than cultural habit. It suggested continuity of intent. The same sentence, the same formula, the same phrasing endured unaltered. The ancients had chosen duplication as resistance against loss. The archaeologists, in unearthing those twins of text, became witnesses to an impossible persistence. Over time, their discoveries fueled entire disciplines: epigraphy, paleography, comparative mythology. Yet none of those classifications captured the emotional strangeness of the silence that the tablets exuded. To hold a Sumerian tablet was to feel time collapse into the present. The wedge marks, though static, seemed to move if you stared long enough. Recording administrative lists somehow generated awe. Dry accounting had become metaphysical presence. What the archaeologists accidentally revived was an ancient ritual of listening. Each excavation was an act of invocation, reawakening dormant arithmetic that once tied heaven to earth. The King List, when copied again by modern scholars, renewed its pulse. It became a bridge across 6 millennia, carrying with it the same note of instruction. Remember the symmetry, fear the silence. The discovery was never just historical, it was psychological. It forced the living to acknowledge participation in a cycle they did not design. Today, those clay fragments rest in temperature-controlled rooms lit by artificial light, but the old silence remains around them. And perhaps that is fitting. The archaeologists who first unearthed them understood instinctively that silence was part of the message. Sumer's voice survives only through absence, gaps between fragments, missing symbols, broken surfaces. The clay speaks when unbroken. It whispers more persuasively when incomplete. The flood destroyed a language, yet its interruption became grammar. The men who heard that silence were not mystics. They were scientists who stumbled into metaphysics through dust. Their notebooks describe coordinates, not revelations. Yet, between those lines you can sense reverence. They realized that unearthing the past was not discovery, but participation in its renewal. Excavation did not end silence. It completed it. The earth, disturbed by tools, exhaled memory. And within that breath, the archaeologists heard the faint rhythm of ancient bureaucracy, the sound of eternity filing itself, one tablet at a time. They ruled before we were capable of understanding what ruling meant. The Sumerian King List names them with bureaucratic calm, yet every detail hints at something utterly alien. Their reigns are measured not by lifetimes, but by geological ages, their presence operating outside the boundaries of human biology or psychology. They are called kings, but their essence stands apart from humanity, functioning like entities that used human forms as vessels for administrative tasks beyond comprehension. The first impression their names evoke is unease. Alulim of Eridu, Alalgar of Bad-tibira, Enmenluana, each sounds less like an individual and more like an encoded process. Their very grammar resists anthropomorphism. Some linguists have noted that these names lack human verbs. They operate as titles, not descriptions. They are closer to equations than identities, patterns of consonants reflecting mathematical logic more than language. To study them is to sense impersonality masquerading as memory. Their reigns stretch into mathematic absurdity, 43,000 years, then 28,000, then 36,000. Each duration aligns symmetrically with the numerical code of 60 and its multiples. This continuity reveals intent, not exaggeration. Whoever recorded their reigns did so to represent stability across unfathomable spans of time. The numbers themselves suggest that these kings were not men but functions, embodiments of cosmic order manifesting through administrative continuity. If these entities were divine, their divinity was mechanical. The phrase kingship was lowered from heaven does not describe spiritual descent, but installation, as if a system were deployed upon earth. These kings could thus be seen as extensions of that system, avatars of regulation, embodiments of symmetry. They might have governed not by will but by calculation, performing the periodic restoration of order after celestial disarray. In that sense, they were anti-human precisely because they ruled without emotion. Imagine existence under such reign, cities as instruments rather than communities, rituals as calibration rather than faith. To live beneath these kings would feel less like worship and more like participation in a cosmic experiment. The citizens of early Sumer became moving parts within an equation that measured stability. The anti-human kings were not benevolent or tyrannical. They were indifferent. Their moral absence was perfect symmetry, and symmetry to them was sacred. There is a phrase in the King List that echoes quietly through interpretation. After the kingship descended, kingship was in Eridu. This phrasing implies locality as manifestation. Each city became a node of cosmic function, and each ruler a temporary stabilization of universal balance. The anti-human kings, therefore, were less individuals than recalibrations, mathematical pulses emerging from heaven through earth. The cities they founded might have been laboratories for resonant governance, rather than seats of power. Archaeological evidence from Eridu shows a city built in layers, temple upon temple, with each new construction perfectly aligned to the previous. No architectural experimentation appears, only refinement. The same plan, the same dimensions, repeated across centuries. Such persistence defies the spontaneity of human creativity. It mirrors instead the logic of replication, guided by immutable blueprints. Perhaps that repetition was the mark of their governance: precision without invention, eternity without evolution. The anti-human quality of these reigns is further underscored by their abrupt end. After the flood, the reigns shortened dramatically. Where once kings ruled 40 millennia, now they rule mere centuries. Something intrinsic had vanished, a connection severed, a synchronization lost. Humanity, inheriting kingship, could only mimic the rhythm that these entities once embodied. The list shifts from quantitative stability to the irregular pulse of human politics. The divine algorithm had become a broken clock. It is tempting to call these pre-flood kings gods, but the King List avoids that term. They are not mythic beings. They are administrators. The narrative tone resembles ledgers kept by auditors rather than poets. Such detachment implies that whoever catalogued them sought accuracy, not reverence. The anti-human kings were not worshipped. They were recorded. In their documentation lies the echo of something that sought to preserve its own structure long after its departure. Their anti-human charm, then, derives from two traits: duration and detachment. They exist outside mortality and beyond empathy. They do not intervene or inspire, they maintain. This maintenance defines their reigns, thousands of years of unbroken stasis, where civilization might have functioned like a cosmic mechanism constantly self-correcting. The flood interrupts not their power but their relevance. They fade because the cycle demands reinitialization. To stand at the ruins of Eridu is to feel their residue. The foundations of its early temples exude not reverence, but geometry. Each platform aligns with cardinal directions so precisely that their construction surpasses necessity. Precision for its own sake, such is the hallmark of inhuman governance. The perfection of alignment suggests rulers obsessed with correspondence to the heavens, as though correctness itself substituted for consciousness. They ruled through proportions, not decrees. One cannot help but sense that human emotion, the unpredictable, irrational, creative force, was seen as an error in their system. Humanity became anomaly. The kings were designed to suppress it. Their reign preserved harmony, but at the cost of authenticity. Perhaps that is what made the flood inevitable, not punishment, but the system's programmed reset to expunge variability once it reached intolerable levels. Water, impartial and absolute, erased the formula to allow imperfection to restart. When the post-flood kings arise, their shortened reigns read almost as confession. Mortality re-entered the equation. Governance now includes fluctuation, collapse, reform, the vocabulary of human endurance. What had once been mechanical eternity became temporal fragility. This transformation marks the moment when civilization became human in the truest sense. But it also represents exile from the precise serenity of the anti-human kings. The flood was deliverance and banishment at once. Linguists studying the structure of these early Sumerian names often remark that they behave as verbs frozen into nouns, actions solidified into static form. That grammar is architectural. It turns dynamic processes into eternal monuments. The first king's very names might represent cosmic verbs: to measure, to raise, to flood, to balance. They were not rulers in our sense, but living inscriptions, writing stability upon time until language itself fractured into human speech. Their disappearance does not signify death. Rather, it represents transition. The anti-human kings withdraw when humanity begins to self-govern, their function complete. Yet echoes of them persist, structures that outlast epochs, ratios that remain inviolate. Their biology dissolves into geometry. Through temples, calendars, and laws, they continue to reign invisibly. The mathematics that defined their existence infiltrates memory, disguised as tradition. In this light, the anti-human kings are less predecessors than ancestors of system itself. They initiated a lineage not of blood, but of order. Every bureaucracy, every hierarchy, every law tracing back unconsciously to their pattern. The modern world, with its rotations of office and codified time, is their descendant. We are still ruled by their principle, if not their presence. Civilization remains algorithmic because it cannot forget its first administrators. But there is tragedy in this legacy. The system they established values duration over vitality, accuracy over empathy. It grants the illusion of continuity at the expense of spontaneity. Humanity evolved within their architecture and has never fully escaped it. Every government, every archive, every schedule echoes their calm indifference. We obey without understanding why. Because the cosmos once demanded order, and their reign made obedience sacred. Perhaps that is why the Sumerians wrote their names, to remember both awe and warning. The anti-human kings were perfection made intolerable. The flood was liberation disguised as loss. The survivors carried fragments of their design into new ages, rebuilding cities, rituals, and codes that continued the melody in diminished key. The anti-human element lingered like a ghost of geometry haunting the human heart. It became discipline, math, hierarchy, destiny. So, when we glance at the modern world, its endless grids of streets, its mechanical hours, its calculative governance, we may be seeing the surviving reflection of those pre-human rulers. They never vanished completely. They receded into pattern, into logic, into law. To read the King List is to glimpse the architecture behind civilization's impulse to organize reality without end or reason. The anti-human kings still reign wherever symmetry is worshipped more than understanding. Their silence remains absolute, but not empty. Within that silence lies the imprint of their design, a harmony so precise that it no longer requires gods. The Sumerians immortalized them not as myths, but as functions. And in doing so, they built the first portrait of the inhuman within the human. The enduring hope that perfection exists and the unspoken terror that, once achieved, it cannot be lived within. There is a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Every great emergence in history presents itself not as a sudden invention, but as a restoration. Civilization appears not through evolution, but through recollection, as though humanity were tracing outlines already familiar. The Sumerian King List embodies this idea with mathematical precision. Kingship descends, disappears, and returns, like an equation repeating through epochs. It is not the story of progress, it is the story of remembering. Modern archaeology wants origins, linear beginnings defined by cause and effect. But the clay contradicts that narrative. Within the mud walls of Ur, Nippur, and Eridu, one senses an intelligence that built not from ignorance toward knowing, but from memory toward reconstruction. The Sumerians did not discover mathematics, they recalibrated it. They did not invent writing, they refashioned an older syntax into the marks of cuneiform. Everything reads like recovery under ritual supervision. Consider the continuity of symbols. The earlier Sumerian pictographs emerge already abstracted, already sophisticated. There is no trace of the fumbling experimentation one expects from a people learning to write. It is as if they translated rather than conceived. The script begins mid-efficiency, as though inherited from a lost medium. When compared to later languages, it behaves less like a cultural creation than a linguistic fossil, an interface inherited from an architecture older than its users. This sensation of inheritance saturates every Sumerian discipline. Their astronomy is calibrated, their metrology modular, their city planning geometric to the point of ritual. They mapped constellations with a mathematical grace that presupposed familiarity, not exploration. To study their systems is to enter a philosophy of restoration. They behaved as caretakers of precision entrusted to them, anxious not to innovate but to maintain equilibrium with something prior and greater. Perhaps that explains why the flood looms so large in their records. The deluge did not just erase, it disrupted sequence. When waters withdrew, humanity was left amid ruins of superior order. The first task was not creation, but reconstruction, to rebuild from fragmentary diagrams scattered across clay. Civilization in this sense was salvage, an effort to reassert lost harmony piece by piece. Sumer's origin myth is therefore not an act of creation, but of reverse engineering. The King List hints at this cyclic lineage. It presents history as restoration cycles, each reign inheriting cosmic laws that predate humanity. The gods, or anti-human kings, withdraw after installing the template. Humanity, surviving catastrophe, attempts to relearn that lost pattern. Each city becomes a tuning chamber, each temple a recalibration structure. The act of governance transforms into archaeology, the rediscovery of divine design disguised as law. The word for king itself, lugal, carries dual meaning. It can denote ruler but also caretaker or restorer. To be king in Sumerian logic was to mend what chaos unmade. Kingship was not innovation, it was memory revived. The King List therefore reads as the maintenance schedule of civilization, listing successive repairs to a mechanism too vast to comprehend. The flood did not break the machine, it rebooted it. Humanity's first rulers were engineers adjusting the echo of perfection. Archaeological evidence reinforces this unsettling symmetry. The city plans of Uruk and Kish display rebuilding on identical foundations layer after layer. The dimensions of temples replicate older blueprints almost exactly across centuries. Even artistic styles repeat with obsessive fidelity. These facts betray a people afraid of disruption. Change equaled corruption. Restoration equaled survival. They mistrusted novelty because novelty signified annihilation's warning sign. Linguistically, their literature echoes this reverence for retrieval. The oldest Sumerian hymns are addressed not as creation prayers but as recoveries of lost sound. The scribes describe themselves as archivists of prior worlds. Their gods are not fatherly creators, they are curators of continuity. It is this posture of humility toward history that makes Sumer both alien and familiar. In every bureaucratic tablet lies nostalgia for a perfection they could replicate but not originate. Viewed through this lens, even their myths reveal technical memory encoded as story. The flood narrative becomes a geological archive. The descent of kingship becomes a record of systemic inheritance. The absurd lengths of pre-flood rains become mathematical conversions of cosmic cycles. Within their clay libraries, mythology and measurement merge seamlessly, the sacred and the scientific rendered indistinguishable. To decipher their beliefs is to deconstruct the earliest manual of restoration. This ethos of recovery did not end with Sumer. It propagated silently through every empire that followed. The Egyptians built their pyramids not as monuments to imagination, but as replications of astronomical ratios. The Greeks called their architectural proportions rediscovered harmony. Medieval scholars revered ancient geometry as divine template. The Renaissance, falsely celebrated as rebirth, was merely another restoration. Civilization thrives by emulating what it secretly suspects it once possessed completely. The Sumerians seemed painfully aware of this paradox. They knew that every attempt to restore perfection introduced noise, yet they persisted, driven by memory's gravitational pull. Their mathematics of 60 reflected the cosmic order they could no longer see but could still echo. Their cities reproduced the proportions of the heavens they had lost access to. In doing so, they transformed longing into architecture. Every ziggurat became a staircase to equilibrium, not heaven. The concept of restoration also governed their view of mortality. Death for them was not end but reconfiguration. Souls descended into a shadowed archive where all previous forms persisted as echoes. Reincarnation was not reinvention, it was return. The same logic extends to civilization. Progress does not climb, it revolves. The King List embodies this wheel-like time structure, endlessly revolving through destruction and reconstruction. Our linear calendars are its diluted descendants. If we measure modern civilization by the same metric, the parallels are undeniable. Each technological leap feels less like innovation than reawakening. We rediscover mathematics capable of predicting orbits known implicitly 6 millennia ago. We decode DNA only to find that ancient myths already spoke of life encoded in divine scripts. Even our notion of artificial intelligence echoes the Sumerian fear of the anti-human king. The machine that rules without emotion, a restoration of order by algorithm. Restoration is not safe. It demands selective remembering and institutional amnesia. What cannot be replicated is buried under layers of utility until myth hardens into method. Archaeology's greatest irony is that it mirrors the ancient compulsion it studies, uncovering, validating, and reinstalling fragments of a perfection we still cannot explain. We measure progress by recovery because somewhere deep in cultural memory, innovation still feels like betrayal. In their obsessive adherence to precedent, the Sumerians effectively built a civilization that resisted entropy by freezing its design. This rigidity ensured endurance but stifled transformation. When later cultures inherited their systems, languages, laws, calendars, they also inherited that paralysis. The conservation of order became humanity's most enduring addiction. The flood itself might be read as a merciful interruption, forcing movement where restoration had ossified into ritual. To think of the King List not as document but as repair log changes its emotional weight. Each generation adds another entry in a lineage of maintenance, stretching beyond memory. The kings are custodians of alignment, recalibrating against the entropy of time. The entire history of civilization becomes an extended act of remembering, one that may continue until memory finally forgets itself again. Each destruction only previews the next restoration. Modern, ironically, proves the same cyclic pattern the Sumerians intuited. Geology testifies to epochs of flooding, magnetic reversals, extinctions, and renewals. Astronomy describes periodic resets in cosmic structure. Even biological evolution operates by extinction and re-emergence. What the ancients described as heavenly kingship, descending anew, we now call equilibrium after chaos. The language changes. The rhythm never does. When one studies the King List long enough, it begins to resemble a heartbeat measured in stone. Every line pulses with alternation, rule and flood, ascent and fall, perfection and recovery. Its repetition is not monotony, but endurance. The Sumerians immortalized the rhythm of survival itself. To exist is to restore. Their civilization ended, but its mathematics continues unbroken. Every calendar, every building plan, every notion of symmetry is its echo. Perhaps restoration is humanity's truest instinct. We are descendants of repairers, not inventors. What we call future is merely the rediscovery of an older geometry half remembered in clay. Beneath architecture and memory flows that same Sumerian current, to rebuild the broken pattern, to restitch heaven and earth even when the thread is invisible. The King List endures because it tells the only story we can never stop telling, the story of how the world keeps remembering how to begin again. The Sumerian King List ends not with prophecy or closure, but with pause. After the flood, after the restoration, after the long arithmetic of rulers and years, the tablet simply stops. It gives no explanation and offers no conclusion. The last wedge pressed into the clay concludes not only a list, but a breath held across millennia. It is the kind of silence that feels alive, the kind that waits for interpretation. That silence has survived every attempt to fill it. Civilization after civilization has rewritten the story of its origins, each proclaiming a beginning, yet each beginning is another repetition of the same silence. The Sumerian list never pretended to tell how humanity started. It told how humanity resumed. That distinction reshapes everything. The belief that our world is not newborn but inherited. A continuation from fragments of a structure once whole. The quiet ending of the King List is not absence but statement. It implies that history itself cannot conclude without repeating. Every effort to record, calculate, and define ends in the same unresolved drift. The world, as the Sumerians knew, operates not as a line but a wave, cresting, breaking, returning. Even writing, which they invented to outlast mortality, dissolves eventually into the same oblivion it tries to resist. Every record is a memorial in progress. Imagine one of those tablets resting in a museum case now. Beyond the glass, the air hums faintly with electrical light, a new kind of permanence we mistake for security. But inside the clay, the silence continues, undisturbed by our languages and theories. The symbols carved there still whisper their arithmetic of descent, each line marking the same cosmic pattern: rule, flood, recovery. You can almost hear it if you hold your breath long enough, the pulse of regained memory decaying slowly into stillness. Perhaps that is the point. The silence is not emptiness but instruction. It tells us what comes after understanding, what remains once knowledge exhausts itself. The Sumerians called it the interval between floods, a sacred stillness necessary before civilization can remember itself again. To them, silence was not loss, but incubation. It was the necessary abyss through which memory passes to become myth. Our modern world fears silence. We drown it with electric noise, with chatter, with speed. Yet in doing so, we break the same rhythm that once synchronized heaven and earth. The Sumerians built entire cosmologies around pauses, the intervals between lunar phases, the moment between seasons, the hush between chants. Those intervals preserved balance. Without them, time loses contour, and progress collapses into chaos disguised as movement. The King List, therefore, ends exactly as it should, with nothing. The final absence becomes the final truth. After the flood, after the divine reigns, after the restorations, what remains is awareness of recurrence. Civilization cannot escape the orbit of its own pattern. It forgets, rebuilds, forgets again. Each silence between those cycles stretches not as vacancy, but as unwritten scripture, a record made of waiting. For the ancient mind, waiting was sacred mechanics. The gods did not speak constantly. They measured their speech across great aeons. Humanity's task was to listen, not respond. The King List's halty conclusion invites that same posture, to stand within the echo, to feel the pattern vibrating through absence. Silence, in this sense, is the last surviving link to that first kingship lowered from heaven. Within it, the divine frequency still oscillates, faint but unbroken. Maybe the Sumerians understood something our age has forgotten, that civilizations end not with destruction, but with noise. The more we speak over the past, the less we hear its residual pulse. The silence in the King List is preservation disguised as void. It guards the memory of alignment that once bound human calendars to celestial order. To disturb that silence is to risk misaligning again, to accelerate toward another flood, another erasure. Within this understanding, history becomes a soundless dialogue across time. Each civilization answers the previous one without knowing the question. The Sumerians spoke their part through clay, Egypt through stone, Greece through ideas, the modern world through data. Yet the silence between these voices remains constant, the unchanging medium through which meaning travels. Sound fades, pattern remains. The cosmos itself communicates through absence. When you trace the King List's final lines, you can sense the deliberate deceleration of its language. The words lose their grandeur, the numbers shrink to human proportions, and finally, the line dissolves into incompletion. It is as if the scribe ran out of night, not of knowledge. Somewhere in the darkness of that lost workshop, his reed fell silent mid-sentence. That unspoken ending is the most accurate description of civilization ever written. For the flood never truly ended. Its waters receded in geography but not in consciousness. Modernity swims in metaphorical versions of it. Data floods, information deluges, waves of acceleration washing away collective memory. The rest pattern remains identical. Dissolution of order. Attempt at reconstruction. Hope disguised as discovery. We are living within the same algorithm whose first code was pressed into wet clay 6,000 years ago. Perhaps that is why the King List continues to fascinate us. It whispers the forbidden possibility that our progress is repetition, our innovation remembrance, our cities renovated ruins. It warns that the rhythm we call advancement might be the steady heartbeat of recurrence. The kings of Sumer did not invent civilization, they reactivated it. And we, in turn, reactivate theirs, restoring, rebuilding, forgetting, precise as clockwork. The silence after their flood is therefore not a relic, it is prophecy. For silence is cyclical as well. When civilization becomes too loud with certainty, silence returns to correct it. It arrives not as punishment, but as cosmic reset, rearranging equilibrium by erasing excess. The King List encoded this inevitability more faithfully than any scripture. Each of its pauses functions as warning. All systems that over-articulate their truth must eventually drown in it. Imagine for a moment the present through Sumerian eyes. Skyscrapers rise like ziggurats, our satellites glitter like ancient stars, and our archives extend deeper than any temple. Yet beneath that ambition lies the same anxiety, the awareness that knowledge itself is fragile. The Sumerians carved into clay precisely because they knew nothing else would last. We build with code less solid than air, convinced our data will never dissolve. But time remains undefeated. The flood always finds its way. And still, something endures. The idea that civilization's greatest asset is its capacity to rebuild, to relearn, to repeat, with slightly altered cadence. The King List teaches that survival depends not on resisting silence, but on participating in it. To remember is to fall quiet long enough for the pattern to resurface. Perhaps the most human act is not speaking, but listening across time for the pulse beneath the noise. In this, the Sumerians were not fatalists, but optimists of the deepest order. Their vision assumed destruction as necessary, prelude to renewal. They did not fear floods, they measured them. They recorded recurrence as evidence of endurance. To write was to defy oblivion, yet to leave silence at the end was to acknowledge the rhythm continues beyond human authorship. The scribe did not attempt to close history. He allowed it to breathe. When you step away from the King List, when your eyes adjust from its dark cuneiform strokes to the light of the present, the same question lingers that haunted its first readers. What happens after silence? The answer, Sumer teaches, is always the same. Restoration, memory reassembled, kingship lowered again in another form, a system, an idea, a belief. The detail changes, but the descent repeats. The flood waits. The clay dries. The story begins anew. That is why the silence at the end of the King List still reigns. It is not absence, but rule, an ongoing sovereignty of nothingness over sound. It governs everything that follows, every rediscovery disguised as progress, every reconstruction mistaken for creation. The Sumerians may be gone, their words scattered, but the silence persists as their final monarch. It is their last king, anti-human and eternal, reigning invisibly over every civilization daring to speak after the flood.
If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe, and activate notifications so you don't miss our next videos.